This is the Christadelphian video service. Welcome to our session, which is the third of our sections on translations. And our general theme is rightly dividing the word of truth, which is an intended audience of anyone interested in learning how to study their Bibles more effectively. Whether young or old, we're happy that everyone can look at this series about how to look at the Bible more intelligently. So we're going to look at these translations that we've been talking about, but just to remind you of what we've looked at in our previous sessions, the reason why we have various translations is there must be a desire to understand what God actually said, not what men think he wanted to say. And that's the great danger with translations, that many of them, you get the translator's view of what God was saying rather than what God actually said. So we've discussed about the need for us to get literal translation because they focus on getting as close as we can to the original meaning of words. Dynamic translations, of which there are many, are very readable and often say what the translator thinks God said, and that's, of course, not a good area to be in. Doctrinal errors creep in easily to translations because many translators approach the translation process with existing ideas that they favour when they come to putting words into the text. And so there's a need to be wary of translator bias. So just going again to just summarising what literal and dynamic translations are, the focus of literal translation is getting as close as possible to the thing with less thought for easy reading. So they're not really concerned that it might be hard to understand. It might not actually flow like the English would flow, but you're getting back to the original thought in the original language. By dynamic, always easy to read, sometimes using much more modern language, but reflecting the interpretation of the translator. So we need to access the literal to ensure accuracy and use the best of the dynamic for readability, and always be used in that order. And if your dynamic translation doesn't actually follow what the literal is suggesting, then have a very, very close look at the literal again to see whether that's justified. And if it is, you might find your dynamic translation needs to be ignored. Okay, so let's just go on to this one. No translation is perfect. Translators, as we've discussed before, add punctuation, capital letters, chapter divisions, and verses in the record. And we're going to see when we come to our next section about chapter divisions that not all those are helpful. But they've been put in for convenience sake. So they're not part of the original, unless you're dealing with the Psalms and the Book of Lamentations. The chapter divisions we have are not a part of the original. Some early manuscripts have non-inspired marginal notes that were added to the text as scripture, and we've talked about 1 John chapter 5 in the past. Everybody, even the dynamic translations, very largely say that's a spurious insertion into the text. We've noted that Greek and Hebrew words have male and female words. It's not the same with English words. Some Greek words have tense, continuous or historical, and again, that's probably for the serious student to get a look at, but again, it does affect the translation process. There are many cultural allusions and metaphors which the Bible has, which were local to the area, such as Mammon and Beelzebub, who were local gods of Syria and the Philistines, and the Hebrew word Satan, which was a very common word in the Hebrew language, which is used very commonly in the Bible. But sadly, in the Bible, sometimes it's had a capital S put on it as the name of a supposed devil. So always doctrinal bias can intrude, and that's when preconceived ideas are put into the translation. So how did translator bias start? Well, the Catholic Church, which had all the manuscripts from about the 2nd and 3rd century onwards in their control, they adopted some of the pagan ideas from Greek concepts of their gods, of Hades, which was an underworld, demons and a god of the underworld. And they had these concepts and they began to introduce them into Christian thinking. The Catholic Church already believed in immortal souls, heaven going, and a trinity of gods. And again, those ideas were in the translators' minds. The 13 translators that were chosen to put the Bible into English in 1611, they already believed in these popular church ideas. So they twisted many translations of Bible words to support their existing concepts. And this especially happens with the devil, the Trinity, and heaven-going beliefs. Another very dangerous translation to watch out for is the Jehovah's Witness New World Translation. They put it out in stages, as they said they were retranslating the Bible, and the original stages are not too bad. but they had explanatory notes, which they put against the translation they made up until 1961, when it came out as one book with the notes, which were their interpretations, now into the Bible text. So the New World Translation is a very, very dangerous translation if you want to get close to the truth. So when we talk about translator bias, you might be familiar with carpet bowls, and they are called biased carpet bowls. So under that dot on the coloured bowl there is a piece of lead. And what that does is it means the bowling ball is actually weighted on one side. So when you throw it down the carpet, the weight drives it towards the left. Or if you put the weight the other side, it'll drive it towards the right. So, carpet bowls or even lawn bowls have exactly the same principle. It's weighted on one side, and that's called a biased bowl. And that's what we're saying happens in the minds of translators who come to translate the Bible into English, but already having a very firm view of what they believe on certain doctrinal subjects. And so this little cartoon just shows you a translator, but when he comes across a word that in the Hebrew is the word diabolos, he immediately thinks this is the devil, and so he puts the devil into the record. And we'll say more about that later. So just some examples of translator bias. The early Catholic Church, with their borrowed ideas, they already had these ideas, and so they twisted verses to suggest fallen angels. They favoured including the word devil wherever it would fit, but it didn't always fit. So sometimes they translated the same word as something else because it didn't fit in certain contexts. So you can see this is the problem of translator bias. It brings inconsistency into the translation, and it means that they only put things in that favoured their existing viewpoint. Let's talk about the devil of the Old Testament, because the devil is perhaps the most classic illustration of very poor translation. When you go to the Old Testament, there's only 3 times the word devil was put into the record. And it's a very poor translation. The word in the Hebrew is the word satire, which means it was a goat of one of the idols of the nations. They worship goats, and the references are all to that particular worship of that goat god. And it should have been translated as satire or an idol or something like that, but they put in the word devil because they thought it was a good place to put it, and it gets into the Old Testament. But they've got nothing to do with the concept of the devil, which the churches generally believe. No Jewish writer of the Bible or any of the scribes of that time ever came up with the concept of a fallen angel, devil person. And that, of course, is something that is quite remarkable. You think if there had been a devil from the beginning who was opposing God from the beginning, there would be plenty of records about the origin of that devil and about the things that he did. So nowhere in the Old Testament do any of the popular ideas about the devil occur, but they've been read backwards into books like Job. So when it talks about the sons of God and it talks about certain enemies of Job coming along to worship, that the word devil was put there, or the word Satan was put there as being someone that was opposing the will of God and making it sound like the devil was there with Job. So again, by reading backwards with the popular concept that they had, they put the word Satan back into the record. Church leaders have looked up various passages about certain kings in the Bible, and they've read the devil concept into those passages. And when you go to Isaiah 14, it very clearly says in verse 4 that this is about the king of Babylon. When you go to Ezekiel 28, it's telling you the passage is about the king of Tyre. So these are prophecies that God made against these particular individuals. In Isaiah 14, it talks about the king being brought down to the grave, being eaten up by worms. It talks about the king with his ambitious ideas being completely frustrated. It talks about the nations rejoicing because that particular king is no longer dominating them. And there are many, many things that relate to the king of Babylon. But because there are passages that talk about his fall, translators said, aha, here is the concept of a fallen angel. And instead of just using the name that the Bible uses, which is the name Lucifer, which is the morning star or the day star, the brightest of the stars, they put the name Lucifer, the word Lucifer, into the record, which is a name they dreamed up. And, they put a name in there, and that's become, in many churches, that becomes the name of the devil. Again, that's an interpolation into the record. So be very, very careful when you come to the Old Testament, because you will see that the translators, because of their existing belief in the devil, have read the devil backwards into the record, in particularly in Job and into those passages in Isaiah 14 and Ezekiel 28. But there are no other supporting passages for it, which is remarkable if there was such a person as the devil that they believe in. Well, let's just look at this New Testament devil. The Greek word is the word diabolos, which has two components. Dia means through, like we know about a diameter being the distance through a circle. And bolo, from which you get the English word ball, means to throw at a strike. The idea is of a spear hitting something. So it's all about being striking through. It's actually causing harm. And it has a moral rather than a physical implication. It's not talking about how people are physically wounded. It's talking about how people are attacked, how people are destroyed by powers which come against them. So the idea of the word diabolos is to hurt, to oppose, to slander. So you can see the morality coming into it. To falsely accuse, which is probably the best translation of it, a false accuser. To speak lies, to betray. So when you come to translations, be very, very careful about just reading the word devil and thinking it means what the churches think it means, because this word is used in many, many contexts to talk about the damage that is done by people who make false accusations. So the diabolos, translated as the devil in most translations, is a false accuser, an enemy, or a liar. And especially it relates to human lusts, where human lusts rise up against God and attack other people. Also, when human lust goes on its own course of destruction, it can be called the devil. And that's why Jesus said about Judas that one of you is a devil. And he called that word diabolos, a false accuser. Judas would betray him to the authorities. But his motives and his intent was devilish. It was an occasion that Judas wanted to hurt the Lord Jesus. So Jesus said, one of you is a devil. That's John 6, verse 70. So what is interesting about this word diabolos is that when they found it would not fit in a certain context, they didn't use it. Well, let's come to the 1 Timothy chapter 3, and we're just going to flick through the three contexts where the translators were completely unable to make the word devil into the record. And this just shows you how biased their translation was. So in the 1 Timothy chapter 3, we're talking about the wives of deacons. And we've already had the qualifications of brethren who would, and the word deacon means a servant, the ones who would be chosen to serve the meeting and to work and to do certain functions. But it says their wives had to be good examples as well. And so it says, even so, verse 11, must their wives be grave, which means sober, not slanderers, sober, faithful in all things. So, the wives of deacons had to be exemplary as well. And one of the things they could not be was to be slanderers, and that's your word diabolos. And so you can see that on that occasion, they very correctly translated it into the record as to slander, to falsely accuse. So the wife of a deacon would not be a person that would go around gossiping and spreading rumors and making accusations. They had to assist their husband's work by being a good example to all. So, that was one of the reasons they just could not put devils in. They couldn't put, that they were not allowed to be devils. It just didn't fit. When you come to the 2 Timothy chapter 3 and verse 3, you see we have a description here in the 2 Timothy 3 about dangerous times, perilous times shall come. So here's a prophecy of times when the world will become a very dangerous place. And then it describes the characteristics of that world. You'll see in verse 2 that there's a love of self, they're covetous, they're boasters, proud, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, unthankful, unholy, without natural affection, truce breakers. And then the word diabolos comes up. And again, they couldn't put in devil in there, so they put in false accusers, which is a good translation. So again, you can see that when they couldn't fit devil, they had to put in what it actually did properly mean. When you come over a page to Titus chapter 2 and verse 3, again, we have the qualifications of the wives of those who would be put in charge of the congregation. It says the aged women in verse 3, likewise that they may be in behaviour as becometh holiness, not false accusers. So on 3 separate occasions, the translators just could not fit devils into the record, which makes you wonder then why they insisted on putting devil wherever they could put it. And that just shows you how biased they were. Whenever they could make the word devil in the record, they did. And of course, when people approach the Bible believing already in a fallen angel devil, then they think the translators got it right. Well, they didn't get it right. They got it dreadfully, dreadfully wrong and biased. So why did God use this term diabolos? Well, I want to just explain that to you, because the reason that God used such a strong word as someone who strikes through, someone who causes harm, somebody who makes false accusations, goes right back to the Garden of Eden when sin came into the world. And it came into the world through the ignorance of the serpent mind. The man and the woman had been given a law about the trees, that they could eat of every tree except one particular tree. And if they did, they would surely die. Well, along comes the serpent, and the serpent is an animal. The serpent has no deep appreciation of how God works, of how God will honour his word. So in discussion with the woman, the serpent, having heard the law that the woman recites to him, says, well, I don't think you will die. And that was an assumption based upon ignorance and arrogance. He didn't understand God. He was saying that God would not do what God said. So his reasoning led to the sin of Adam and Eve. And so right from the outset, God puts natural thinking, or any thinking that leaves God out of account, any thinking that says, I'm not going to listen to God, becomes serpent thinking. And human lusts, our natural inclinations we're born with, are naturally opposed to God's ways. Our sinful thoughts convince us that we can disobey God and get away with it. Just like Adam and Eve thought they could get away with it, we convince ourselves that we can get away with sin and disobeying God. So, God uses the term diabolos, of this tendency of human nature to disobey God and to follow its own reasoning rather than to follow what God has said. So I'd like you to come to Psalm 10, because we have a great description in Psalm 10 of the way the human mind thinks, unless it is controlled by the word of God. Now in Psalm 10, it's a psalm about the wicked. So you start off in let's start in verse 2. A description of the wicked goes down to verse 10, or down to verse 13. The wicked in his pride doth persecute the poor. So wicked people tend to persecute other people. Let them be taken in the devices that they have imagined. For the wicked boasteth of his heart's desire. So the wicked people are arrogant. They say, I can do it and get away with it. Whatever I want, I will get. They bless the covetous, whom Yahweh abhorreth. So you have a situation where the wicked man says, well, I like these people because they're getting away with it. They're good crooks. These people seem to be very popular. And so they applaud people that God hates. The wicked, through the pride of his countenance, will not seek after God. And if you look at your margin, all of his thoughts are, there is no God. So the wicked have this concept, well, maybe there's not a God, probably isn't a God, then I can get away with whatever I like. So they won't try and find God, they just pretend he doesn't exist. In verse 5, his ways are always grievous. Thy judgments are far above out of his sight. For all of his enemies he puffeth them. So, again, this is the pride, the arrogance of the natural mind. Look what he says. Look what the wicked says in verse 6. He has said in his heart, I shall not be moved. I shall never be in adversity. So they're boasting about the fact that they can always get away with the things they want to do. His mouth is full of cursing and deceit and fraud. Under his tongue is mischief and vanity. He sits in the lurking places of the village. In secret places does he murder the innocent. His eyes are privily set against the poor. So this is some of the excesses the wicked are capable of. He lies in wait secretly as a lion in his den. He lies in the wait to catch the poor. He doth catch the poor when he draweth him into his net. He croucheth and humbleth himself that the poor may fall by his strong arm, or by his strong ones. So you have a description here of the excesses of the wicked. Once they get into power, once they have control of the money system, they become excessively dangerous. And they do it all because they believe that God is not watching them and that God will not bring them to account. So the prayer of verse 12 and 13 is very, very important. Arise, O Lord, O God, lift up thine hand, forget not the humble. And here's the sin, here's the great sin. Wherefore doth the wicked condemn God? And you see, their arrogance, their boasting, their reasoning is a condemnation of the righteous God of heaven. Here's how they condemn God: by saying in his heart, thou wilt not require it. Thou hast seen it, for thou beholdest mischief and spite, to requite it with thine hand. The poor committed himself unto thee. Thou art the helper of the fatherless. Break the arm of the wicked and the evil man. Seek out his wickedness. So you see, the great problem, the great issue with the wicked mind, with the arrogant mind, with the powerful mind that abuses other people, is they think that God doesn't care. They think that God doesn't see it. They think they will get away with it. And that, God says, is the diabolos in action. This is the falsely accusing God that either he doesn't exist or he doesn't care. Well, here are some of the inconsistencies of the translation of the word devil. Now, you have the word devil in the English form, occurs 112 times in the New Testament. It does not have capitals. You'll see whenever they could put a capital on it, they do. It's not a name. The word devil has been translated from two different Greek words, and we need to be clear that there were two different words that we find translated as devil or devils in our Bible. One is the word daimon or demon, and that occurs 77 times. Now, demons were from the belief of the Greeks. The Greek, of course, was the great cultural influence of the ancient world. And they believed that when a person died, that their little immortal soul would go out, and if it was a bad person, they would inhabit somebody else and make them insane or ill. So there were these little mysterious, invisible little forces that were called demons. And it became a very popular belief right through the Middle East that when anything was insane, when anything was odd, when anything was unusual, when people got sick, that it was the work of demons. And even many, many Jews came to believe in demons. So that's the word talking about the belief, the false belief, that people are inhabited by the souls of departed wicked people. So that was a common mistake in the beliefs of all the people in the Middle East. Basically believed in these things. So getting rid of the 77 demon ones, we come across the 35 diabolos ones, and they are the ones which you need to follow through, because you will see in most contexts that they actually mean something else. So remember the translator bias, put the word devil in the King James Version. The Greek word diabolos means an enemy or a false accuser, and nothing in the Old Testament supports the popular ideas about the devil. So with that in mind, let's just go over what the diabolos does actually mean. It's used in the Bible of our natural mind that tends to disbelief in God. It's used of the natural mind that is selfish and indulgent. And, we naturally resent restrictions. When the word of God says you shall not do this and you shall not do that, and God would be unhappy with that, the natural mind starts to reason about ways that we can get our own will, our own selfish desires fulfilled. And without divine thoughts or morals, men act corruptly and out of self-interest. So the diabolos is human lust working in people. It can be working in individuals like Judas. One of you is a devil, said Jesus. One of you is the diabolos. It can be in organizations. There are organizations that have evil motives, and there are governments that also take an evil course through history, and they are also called the work of the devil because they are motivated by human lust and human arrogance. But particularly the devil makes false accusations about God and his servants. And this, of course, is people who rise up and actually falsely accuse God's servants. One of these was the Emperor Nero. And Peter said about him that your adversary, the devil, as a roaring lion walks about, seeking whom he might devour, because Nero was a man that had no justice in him. He was a terrible individual when it came to his own personal morality. He was a violent man, and he ended up putting Paul to death, and probably Peter as well, the apostles, and many other people were put to death by Nero. And so he was called by Peter, he called him the devil, the diabolos, the false accuser. And that's what they do. They actually false accuse God's servants. Well, getting back to literal translations, the best literal translations we have is Rotherham and Diaglott and the Interlinear Bible. And you will find when you go to Rotherham that the translation of the word diabolos is always the enemy. The same in the Revised Version, it's always the enemy. In the Diaglott, you have false accuser. And, you know, these reliable literal translations will not go along with this concept of putting the word devil in wherever it can fit. And so you're getting very closer to what God actually said. And once you understand that the diabolos is the human nature that opposes God and will not submit itself to God's will, then you can see why they translate it as the enemy or the false accuser or the adversary. And you can get both devil and Satan properly translated in these translations. Other translations we recommend for use, we've got on the bottom there, we've already shown you that, but just again, some very good other translations to use. But when you want to get accuracy, go to the literal translations that are there. And so we come to the homework for this last section on translations. I'd like you to go through the whole 35 uses of diabolos in the King James New Testament, work out who it's talking about, whether it's a person, a government, an organization, and just write in your margin what it actually is. And you read the RV, the Revised Version, you'll notice the use of the word enemy all the way through. So these are the translations that are reliable. These are the translations that are helpful. Unfortunately, with the King James translation, we have to suffer the existing beliefs, the translator bias that was there in 1611, which brought the devil and the Satan very much into prominence in the record when it should not be. So thank you for that session, and we'll be moving on next time to talk about chapter divisions.